All right, good morning. I think we're going live here, hopefully. If you are out there and you want to give me a comment, you can let me know you're seeing us. We'll wait several minutes to let people join in. I'm a little early. Good morning, Cindy. As people pop on, if you want to drop in a comment, let us know you're here. That'd be great. Looks like there's 6 of you out there somewhere. Appreciate you joining us this morning. Up to 8 people. It's my first time to do the Facebook Live class, so I'm very much a rookie at this. But it looks like there are people joining. So like I said, feel free to give me a comment if you like. Let us know you're here. I'm going to peek over on my phone and see if I can confirm that we're streaming. Decided to take advantage of the nice weather this morning, so I'm doing this outside in the backyard. Seems like a good idea. Hopefully, had a good bit of mosquitoes in our backyard, so hopefully I don't get driven inside. But there's 3 other streaming Sunday school classes going on inside, so we are limited on space. So here I am outside. Morning, Amy. Thanks for popping in. Carol, good morning. Good to see you. See you as it is. Hope everybody's had a good week. It is lovely out, Cindy. You're right. George, good to see you. Good morning. Hope everybody's had a good week. Ours has been pretty eventful here at the DeMent house. My son Elias, who is 13 and 8th grader, went back to in-person school this week at the junior high, at Lake Highlands Junior High. So that's been an event here at our house. And then my daughter Virginia, who is an 11th grader, she goes back to in-person class tomorrow at Lake Highlands High School. So things are happening. Things are progressing. We feel pretty good about it. Not too worried. Elias had a good week at school. He said it's kind of weird having they have these plastic dividers that they have to carry with them from class to class and set up on their desks, and then in the cafeteria as well, eating lunch. So definitely a different way for these kids to do school, but it is what it is these days. So Elias did well with it. Virginia goes back tomorrow. We'll see. Still have people joining on. That's great. Like I said, if you are new to the Facebook Live class, like I am, this is my first time to do it. There's comments there. Good morning, Becky. Feel free to drop those in there. Once we get going with the lesson, I will try to pop over there and look every now and again. I know there's a bit of a delay. But if you've got a burning question, feel free, or a comment, put it over there. If I can't get to it during the actual lesson, then I will respond afterwards and get back to you with the answer to your question or response to your comment. But we'll give a couple more minutes so that our numbers keep ticking up here of people jumping on. So welcome if you're just now getting on. I will go ahead and tell you we're going to be in the book of 2 Kings this morning. 2 Kings chapter 6 is where we're going to start. So if you want to go ahead and turn there as you need to, if you've got a Bible, want to follow along, that is where we're going to be. Still have people popping on. This is great. Good morning, everybody. Morning, Mary Jackman. Good to see you. So, one of my favorite things about the Bible is the stories. The Bible's full of all sorts of different kinds of literature. There's the poetry of the Psalms. There's There's the letters in the New Testament. Um, all great, all valuable, obviously. I'm much more of a narrative kind of person. I like to follow the stories. Um, Particularly enjoy kind of looking at the stories that maybe aren't as commonly read or commonly known. I enjoy kind of diving into those and maybe opening people's eyes to some stories that they don't know about that are there. Um, Particularly working with the youth over the years, it's been fun to introduce them to some stories that they had no idea were in there in the pages of the Bible. Particularly as kids when we grow up in the church, there's the certain stories we hear over and over again, particularly the ones that we feel like are safe or that we can make more appropriate, I guess, maybe for kids. Um, but the reality is there's a whole lot more out there. Um, and in fact, some pretty interesting stuff. I tell people a lot that screenwriters in Hollywood don't have anything compared to some of what we can find in the pages of Scripture. Some pretty wild stories, and so I always find it fun to kind of go back and look at those and maybe shed some light on these lesser known stories. So we're going to do that a little bit this morning. Look at a story that is definitely not, I think, as well known maybe. It's not one of those what I call VBS stories that you remember from when you were a kid. Some of the details of the story we're going to look at don't work well with coloring pages for kids, or maybe a felt board, if you can remember back to those days of the things that we did when teaching these stories. So that's the kind of story we're going to be looking at today. Some details that will kind of maybe be a little bit shocking, and some one of those weird stories of the Bible that doesn't get told quite as often. So I'll give you a little bit of historical context for where we're going to be. Like I said, 2 Kings chapter 6 is going to be where this story is found. Again, wanted to make sure you're using the comments if you want to ask questions or tell me to repeat something, whatever it might be. So the book of 2 Kings, so historically where we are kind of in the history of Israel, this is a period of time known as the divided kingdom. So if you remember, we'll go all the way back to Moses. Moses leads the people out of captivity in Egypt. They wander around in the desert for 40 years. They finally get into the promised land. Joshua leads the people into the promised land. They settle. They have the conquest of the land. The tribes divide up and kind of each settle in their own part. And they are ruled for a period of time by the judges. These individuals that would come up and lead the people as needed. They were much more tribal. They weren't really unified into one thing. So these different judges would come up as needed to either lead a military campaign or give guidance in some kind of way. So the period of the judges, there's some good moments, a lot of bad moments during that time. Eventually, the people become desirous of having a king, because after all, everybody else has one and they want one as well. So they go to Samuel, who's acting as the prophet then in Israel, decide they want a king. Samuel warns them against this, says you don't need a king. You have this unique relationship with God. You don't need a human in that role. But the people continue to push and they insist. God relents, tells Samuel if they want it, give it to him. So Saul gets anointed as the first king. Things go well for Saul for a period of time, and then things go really south for Saul. David is next in line. David comes up and is the king after Saul. There's a whole lot that goes into making that happen. But David eventually comes to the throne and actually unites these 12 kind of disparate tribes into one united kingdom. So we have the period of the United Kingdom in Israel's history. David and then his son Solomon is the king after that. So this is about 1000-ish BC, whenever David unites the kingdom. They have this period where things go well, and then things don't go well. Um, After Solomon's death, he has these two sons, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and they just can't seem to figure out how to get along. So there is a split, and each one becomes king over different parts. So you have the 10 northern tribes become the kingdom of Israel, and you have the two southern tribes become the kingdom of Judah. So you enter into a period in 930 BC, roughly, of the divided kingdom, where you have this northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. So this is kind of chronicled in the book of Chronicles and the book of Kings as well. Now, when you read these books, it's important to understand they're not typical histories. There's more, they're telling a story about these kings, the people, and more importantly, how God interacts with the people during this time. So you've got this couple of 100-year period of the divided kingdom, where you have these various kings coming to the thrones in Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And for the most part, these kings are not good. They do not maintain the covenant. They do not remain faithful to God, and things just go from bad to worse. By 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrians. In 722, they are swept away, and that northern kingdom, those 10 tribes of the north, are gone forever. They never reestablished in any kind of way, so they're gone in 722. The southern kingdom of Judah hangs on for a while longer. They make it to 587 BC, and then they eventually fall to Babylon and are taken into captivity, and begins the period of the exile. So that's kind of a quick historical sketch of what's going on with the people of Israel at this time. So we are in 2 Kings, so it's in that divided kingdom time frame. So again, we're going to be 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 24 is where our story is going to be today. So this is taking place somewhere in the mid-800s BC. So we're kind of in the middle of this divided kingdom period. So what I'm going to do is kind of read through this story, and we'll stop along the way and kind of hit some highlights and talk through. There's going to be three primary characters, or groups of characters, that we'll be dealing with in the story. The first is going to be the king of Israel, and that's how he's referred to in the story. He's not mentioned specifically by name. We assume it's probably King Jehoram, who was the king around this time, but he's not specifically mentioned by name. Some of that is intentional, so that these stories are less about the individual kings, as they are about God's activity among the people. So that's kind of an intentional narrative device that gets used in some of these stories. So the king of Israel, there's going to be the prophet Elisha, who's referred to as the man of God. He's another one of our main characters. And then there's going to be this group of characters, these 4 lepers, who are going to be primary movers in the story. So the king, Elisha, and then these 4 lepers are going to be our primary action drivers in the story. So we'll just start reading through it. Like I said, I'll pause along the way and kind of hit some highlights. So starting in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 24. We've got this. It says, sometime later, King Ben-Hadad of Aram mustered his entire army. He marched against Samaria and laid siege to it. As the siege continued, famine in Samaria became so great that a donkey's head was sold for 8 shekels of silver, and 1/4 a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. So, as would happen periodically during this time of the divided kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel is under attack from foreign powers. In this case, Ben-Hadad of Aram, which was modern-day kind of Syria. So he has marched against Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, and has begun a siege. Now remember, a siege is basically you set up around the outside perimeter of the city. Nothing is allowed in, no supplies in, no people out, and basically you just wait it out and you basically starve the people to death inside. And so that's what we're in the midst of as we begin this story. So, not a great situation for the people. In fact, and they say the famine has become so bad, like it says, that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels and 1/4 a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels. Now, I will admit I am not an expert in ancient foreign economies, but what I can tell you is things are bad, right? A donkey's head, not exactly the choicest of cuts, and that's going for big money. So um, these two points here, it's not so much to get hung up on the actual amount, but it's making this point that things are really bad inside the city. So we pick up in 26. It says, "Now as the king of Israel was walking on the city wall, a woman cried out to him, 'Help my lord king.' He said, 'No, let the Lord help you. How can I help you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?' But then the king asked her, 'What is your complaint?'" So, king's out walking around the city, not much else to do, and he's approached by this woman who asks for help. At first, he kind of puts her off, and then finally he says, "Okay, fine. What's your problem?" So then the woman tells him this story. She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give up your son. We will eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son, and now we will eat him.' But she has hidden her son." Okay? So just to review, in case you thought you heard something weird in there, you did. So the situation has become so dire inside the city that the people are turning to these incredibly desperate maneuvers to try to survive. So what you heard is correct. These two women conspire together and they resort to cannibalism of their own children in order to have food. So the woman's complaint to the king, interestingly, is not that we had to resort to this level to survive, but rather we had a deal. We were going to eat my son one day and then her son the next day. And her complaint, again, is not that they had to do that, but that the other woman reneged on the contract. She broke the deal and wouldn't give her son up. So that's what her complaint is. So again, this is one of those stories that's supposed to really hit you with, you're supposed to be taken aback by that and realize this is how bad the situation is. So the king hears this. This is when the king heard these words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now, since he was walking on the city wall, the people could see that he had sackcloth on his body underneath. So this is in there. Sackcloth and ashes was a common way of grieving and basically showing that he is trying to be in submission to whatever God would have. So he's wearing these sackcloths. He tears that. Everybody can see that if the king's wearing sackcloth, he acknowledges how bad of a situation we're in as well. And he declares, "So may God do to me and more, if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, stays on his shoulders today." So he dispatched a man from his presence. So here's the introduction of the next significant character, Elisha. So the king's response to this horrible story he's just heard about these two women cooking and eating children in order to survive is basically to blame Elisha for some reason that makes sense to him. So he's like, "There's nothing I can do. Let's go get Elisha, this man of God, because it must be his fault in some kind of way." So this is a pretty significant refusal to accept responsibility, right, by the king. So this is going to be our first kind of, if you think of the story as like a play, that was Act 1. So there's kind of the end of the first scene, all taking place out on the walls of the city, where we're given the information about how bad and how dire the situation is. The king hears this story from this woman about eating their children. He rips his clothes and basically wants to have Elisha killed. So scene, and then you move to the next part. It says, "Now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Before the messenger arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Are you aware that this murderer has sent someone to take off my head? When the messenger comes, see that you shut the door and hold it closed against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" And while he was speaking with them, the king came down to him and said, "This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I hope in the Lord any longer?" But Elisha, we'll stop there for a second. So he sends a dispatch to go and get Elisha. Elisha, in some kind of prophetic moment, sees that they're coming, understands that they're coming to get him, tells him to kind of his people to block the door. And then the king says this interesting thing, which gives us some insight into kind of an overarching theme that runs through these stories what we find in the book of Kings and Second Kings. This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I hope in the Lord any longer? This is really kind of at the core of what is the problem with these kings in Israel and Judah as well, is that they don't have the capacity, they don't have the ability, or they just don't want to trust God in these situations. So it's a lot of these stories are written as indictments of these kings about how they failed in the covenant, or how they failed to remain faithful to God. So the king here basically just lays it out. He says, "Why should I have hope in the Lord any longer? This trouble is from God. God is doing this. God's not saving us. Why do we even mess with God anymore?" Basically. So then Elisha moves into kind of prophet mode. But Elisha said, "Hear the word of the Lord." Now, anytime you hear a prophet say that, get ready, because that's kind of their job, is to speak the word of the Lord, right? "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a measure of choice meal shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Then the captain on whose hand the king leaned said to the man of God, "Even if the Lord were to make windows in the sky, could such a thing happen?" But he said, "You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat from it." So again, not an expert in ancient economies, but basically what Elisha is saying is that by this time tomorrow, remember, as desperate as the situation was, as it was presented earlier in the story about the donkey's head and 80 shekels and all that kind of stuff, Elisha says that by this time tomorrow, things are going to be back to normal, even better. There's going to be supplies, plenty of food, everything that we need is going to be provided for us by tomorrow. That's a pretty big statement to make in light of everything that we've heard in the story up to this point. So much so, in fact, that one of the king's right-hand guys basically says, "That's not possible, that's not going to happen." Has this quote, he says, "Even if the Lord were to make windows in the sky, such a thing happen." So basically, even if God were to open up the heavens and throw stuff down, he says it's not going to happen. So Elisha says to this guy, not only is it going to happen, but you'll see it, but you won't be able to partake or benefit from it in any kind of way. So put a pin in that, because we're going to find out more about that in just a second. But that kind of brings the second act to a close. So first act, out on the walls, the king has this horrible interaction with this woman about eating babies, and he declares, "I want Elisha killed." Act 2, we move to Elisha's house. They come to get him, and Elisha has this prophetic moment where he declares that by this time tomorrow, everything is going to be fine, and that brings that second act to a close. The next thing we get is Act 3. So it says, "Now there were 4 leprous men outside the city gate, who said to one another, 'Why should we sit here until we die? If we say, let us enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. But if we sit here, we shall also die. Therefore let us desert, go to the Aramean camp. If they spare our lives, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die.' So they arose at twilight to go to the Aramean camp. But when they came to the edge of the camp, there was no one there at all. For the Lord had caused the Aramean army to hear the sound of chariots and of horses, the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, 'The king of Israel has hired the king of the Hittites and the Egyptians to fight against us.' So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, their donkeys, leaving everything just as it was." So these 4 lepers sitting outside the city gates. They're outside the city gates because they are lepers. They're not allowed inside. They are unclean outcast from society. So they find themselves sitting there, knowing what's going on inside, people starving to death, eating children, horrible, awful situation. Out in front of them is this occupying army. They find themselves in the middle, and these lepers look at each other and go, look, it's death either way, right? Like if we stay here, we die. If we go inside, we die. If we go over to the camp, probably die, but maybe something might happen, something good might happen. Maybe they'll just take us prisoner, right? But that's a better situation. So they decide to go. They go to the Aramean camp, and when they get there, they find it completely empty. Not only is it empty, but it is a situation where they could tell everybody just left in a hurry. So we have this interesting note that the Ben-Hadad's army, God made it sound as if there were this rush of invading armies coming, and they get scared and they split. They just take off. So we pick up again. Let's see, where'd I go? I lost my place. Leprous men came to the edge of the camp. They went into a tent, ate and drank, and carried off silver, gold, and clothing, and went back and hid them. Then they came back in another tent and did the same thing. So they go in, and it's like, it's, holiday shopping, right? They go in, there's all this stuff, and so they just start taking everything and going out and hiding it and burying it, and they're like, these are all the supplies we need. And so this is the mode they immediately jump into. But then they said to one another in verse 9, what we are doing is wrong. This is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until the morning light, we will be found guilty. Therefore, let us go and tell the king's household. So they have this kind of aha moment where they're like, wait a minute. We're taking all this stuff. The camp is completely empty. And it suddenly kind of dawns on them, there's an entire city that is starving to death that could use all this stuff. And so they say to each other, we can't just take this stuff and keep it to ourselves. We've got to go back and tell everybody what's going on. So they do. They came and called the gatekeeper of the city and told him, we went to the Aramean camp, but there was no one to be seen or heard there. Nothing but horses tied, the donkeys tied, the tents were as they were. The gatekeeper then calls to the king and says, I will tell you what the Arameans, and it basically gives this report and says, these guys went out there. There's nobody there. Remember, they are held in captivity inside the city because they believe there to be this giant army out there. These 4 lepers come back and say, there's nobody there. So they make that report. The report gets to the king, and the king says, I will tell you what the Arameans have prepared against us. They know we're starving, so they've left the camp to hide in open country, thinking when we come out of the city, then they'll rush us and take us. So one of the servants has this suggestion. He says, let's just send a couple of guys out and see what's going on. So they do. Send a couple of guys out there, send a dispatch out there, and when they come back, they find that it's exactly like they said. They come back and tell the king, there is nobody there. So they went as far as the Jordan, and as they go back beyond through the camp, they can see that there's just stuff littered everywhere that this Aramean army has just been throwing behind them as they leave. So they bring this message back to the king and say, it's true, there's nobody out there. So then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. So, and then see if this sounds familiar, so that a measure of choice meal was sold for a shekel, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Exactly what Elisha said was going to happen, right? Where he said yesterday, by this time tomorrow, this is going to be the situation. The people go out, and that's exactly what happens. The situation that Elisha had said. Now, the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he had leaned to have charge of the gate. That guy from yesterday who said, even if windows in heaven open up, I don't believe it. So now the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. The people trampled him to death in the gate, just as the man of God had said when the king came down to him. For when the man of God said to the king, 2 measures of barley shall be sold, the captain answered, even if the Lord were to make windows in the sky, could such a thing happen? And he answered, you'll see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat from it. And it did indeed happen to him, just as Elisha had said. The people trampled him to death in the gate. Wow. So the story ends with the report coming back that there's nobody out there. This invading army has taken off, and there's nobody there. So the people rush out, get all the supplies they need, bring everything back, and the siege is broken. And you kind of have this, happy moment at the end, except for the guy who, said, even if windows in the sky. Um, so that's how the story ends. That's the end of the third act, and the whole story wraps with this prophecy that Elisha declared the day before comes true. And these four lepers go out, discover that the camp is empty. They come back, they make report. After some hemming and hawing, the king sends some people out. They find it's true, and the people rush out and are sensibly saved. So salvation comes to the people and to the city of Samaria. So the question then becomes, interesting story, some cool details, some kind of disgusting details. It's troubling in a lot of ways, but what do we do with that story? Part of what we do with these biblical narratives is they're not just stories that we tell, but we try to figure out how are these stories somehow telling our story. How do we find ourselves in the midst of what we're reading, so that it's not just some story about a thing that happened, in 850 BC, but what are the ways that story can inform our story today? So I want to leave you with just a few thoughts on that, and maybe some characters in the story to kind of connect with, to say what might we learn from that. So the first thing I want us to do is consider the king. Put yourself in the place of the king in the story, that when this news comes to him that the enemy camp has been abandoned, he doesn't believe it. And the reason he doesn't believe it primarily is because it comes from these four lepers. Who are these guys, right? So put ourselves in the perspective of the king. Are we willing to consider that other people, especially people that we might not consider worthy of listening to, might know more about a situation than we do? Might we accept that another person's perspective might be more informed than our own? Might we consider that they might be right and we might be wrong? Now, in this instance, with the king, it was literally the difference between living and dying, right? He was convinced that there was an army out there and that they were in a hopeless situation. These lepers come back and say, no, there's nobody there. And at first he doesn't believe it. Imagine if he had never taken their word for it. What if he had just said, these guys have no idea what they're talking about, I know better because I'm the king. And the siege were to continue to even more desperate and drastic ends than it did. I think there's a lot to be learned for us in our situations today, right? Are we willing to accept that another person's perspective might be more right on than ours is? For instance, as a middle-class white man, is my perspective the definitive one about racial injustice in our country today? Probably not, right? I probably need to do a lot more listening to people than I do talking about that topic, because my understanding or my experience is very different from someone else's. Like I said, as a middle-class white man, my understanding, my experience of racial injustice is going to be significantly different from that of a person of color. So am I willing to say, you know what, I need to kind of sit this one out and listen to what they have to say, because their perspective is probably more right on than mine is. So I think that's an important lesson we can take from the stories. Are we willing to listen to people that have a different perspective, a different understanding, and realize that ours might be wrong? Put yourselves in the people of the people of the town, people in Samaria, in the city. They were held captive by what they believed to be out there, by the dangers that they thought were there. But in reality, they were wrong, right? They were being held siege at that moment by empty tents. They were locked inside in a desperate situation, starving to death, and the only thing keeping them there was their belief that there was an enemy out there. The reality was they were being held captive. They were being held siege by empty tents. So what are the ways that we in our lives today are held captive by our assumptions that we make about how bad things might be out there? In what ways are we frozen in fear, and the reality is the only thing that's keeping us in place might be empty tents? But the reality is there's nothing for us to be scared about. in this in the world, because um, we end up becoming like the king and saying, well, where is God in the midst of this situation? How can God be trusted? Um, if we were to put ourselves in the position of Elisha, are we willing to believe that there is hope in what appears to be a completely hopeless situation? There was nothing that was going on in the city that would have led Elisha to be able to make that statement, other than his just belief in God, and his trust that God would provide, right? Um, so are we willing to hope and trust in God in situations where it seems like there's really no logical reason to do that? Um, might be hard to do, but I think if we put ourselves in that mindset position of Elisha, to trust that God's not going to leave us abandoned, no matter how desperate the situation might be. And then lastly, these 4 lepers, where I really want us to kind of focus on. Are we willing to be bringers of good news, right, to a world that desperately needs it? So in this situation, like we said, these 4 lepers go out and discover that everything that the people thought was a threat to them was not real. And so initially, they began to just take for themselves and hold on to it and say, well, we're taken care of, we're safe, we're good. But they have this moment where they go, we can't do this. We can't simply keep this good news to ourselves. We must go back and tell the other people. To a world that is frozen in fear and doubt and sees no hope, they say, we've got good news. Is that not the role of the church? We are the bearers, or we are called to be the bearers of God's good news to a world that desperately needs to hear it, that is longing to hear it, that is feeling trapped and under siege. And we know the reality that God is with us in spite of that. So as a church, as the church, if we simply take that good news, take that knowledge we have, that belief that we have, and hold it to ourselves, and don't share that with a world that needs to hear it, what good are we? What are we doing? Then the church becomes nothing more than a club of those of us that benefit from it ourselves. We get good things from it. We get community, we get all these things. We're gonna hoard it and hold it to ourselves, which is where the lepers were at the beginning of their part of the story. But then they stop and they say, no, we can't do this. We have to be about bringing this good news to the world. That is who we are called to be as the church. There is a world that is hurting, that is scared, that is desperate, that needs to hear a word of hope, that needs to know that in spite of how bad the situation appears, in spite of how, maybe not even that it appears, but that it is, I think it's important that we don't wash this away and say, the reality is there's no problems in the world. Things can be bad, things are bad. But the good news that we as the church can bring to the world is that God is with us in spite of that we are not alone. Frederick Buechner says, here is the world, beautiful and terrible things will happen. Fear not, I am with you. That's the word from God. This is the good news that we have, that we are called to share with the world. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to be that? Are we willing to allow the church to be more than just something that we benefit from and we get advantages from? But will we be willing to take that to a world that needs to hear it so desperately? So, hopefully we can find ourselves somewhere in that story. And hopefully we can be the 4 lepers with good news and bring that to a world that needs to hear it. So, that's the story of the siege of Samaria and the 4 lepers. Like I said, maybe one that you've probably heard before, but certainly not one that gets read all the time. So there's a whole lot more stories like that out there in the Bible. It's a fascinating read, and always fun to go and dig into those lesser known troubling stories sometimes. So thanks for joining us this morning on the Facebook. I think I've gone a little bit long, but that's okay. Tune in for worship if you haven't done that yet. Next week, Christine Browder is going to be teaching the Facebook Live class, so I hope that you would come back and join her next week. And so now as we close, I'll offer you this benediction. May you have the wisdom and the humility to receive information from unlikely sources. May you have the hope to believe that God is present even in the most dire of situations. and may we be bringers of the good news to a world desperate to hear it. Amen. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you down the road.